So first of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Norman Blumenthal. We wanted to arrange a speaker for the RJJ parents and the RJJ community. And when speaking to our principals, Mrs. Ackerman remembered when Dr. Blumenthal had spoken a number of years ago, either to her staff or she had heard him speak. And she was so impressed, she went through her contacts and she found the number. And I reached out. That number was from so long ago, it wasn't the correct number. And then I reached out to Dr. Eli Shapiro, and he was so kind to give me your number. And then Mrs. Kopstick, our executive director, realized that you were connected to Ohel. And Mel Zachter is one of our board members. And so it all came together. So we feel so grateful to you to speak to our community and our parent body during this trying time. We have set up our online platforms. Our principals have been terrific, but the feedback we have gotten is obviously some of our parents and their children are under a lot of with the homeschool and being inside. So we're looking forward to hearing you speak and giving us some chizuk during this time. And we are actually dedicating this year in memory of Dr. Marvin Schick and also to Mel Zachter for a full refuah shalema, two people that we care about very much. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. And good evening, everybody. And I hope everyone is well and that those who have been afflicted, that they'll have a refuah shalema, a very speedy recovery, and that we should emerge from this with no further damage in the very near future. And I do want to make honorable mention of Dr. Marvin Schick, who was also somebody I know, and again is one of the many of those who you've lost in the community who are so important. And of course, also, we're very grateful that Mel is recovering for selfish reasons, given all that Mel does for all of us. I also want to thank Ohel, David Mendel, and besides Mel, Jay Kestenbaum, our co-presidium, for giving me the opportunity to give workshops like this or webinars like this. And also to I always feel like we have to thank the technical people. Maybe it's a sign of my age, but we're very grateful that they've been there for us to set up these kind of Zoom conferences and try to think where we'd be now were it not for this technology and those who know how to, or are adept at managing this technology. Let me tell you how it's going to work. I'm going to speak. My anticipation is probably for about a half hour, maybe a little longer. We'll see how it goes. And then we'll leave it open for questions and answers. We have so far 42 participants, which is a nice size group. And also, by the way, I should mention that I do have fond memories of going to RJJ, although usually for not such fond reasons. And so I'm glad it has been a while since I've been at RJJ, because usually that means that things have been going well. But I've always appreciated working with Mrs. Ackerman and all the staff. But anyway, let me tell you how it's going to work. So we have about 42 participants, which is a nice size. We can try, if you'd like, for Q&A, you can unmute yourself, ask a question, then please remute yourself. One of the tricky things I've learned about these Zoom conferences is that you yourself, the person themselves, usually don't realize how disruptive background noise is to the rest of the group. So you're screaming for children under the age of 2 really doesn't bother you so much, but it does create a lot of noise, makes it hard to communicate. So we're going to ask everybody, unless they're asking a question, to please mute themselves, can remain muted. Everybody is muted, and then unmute themselves. I will tell you that my grandson had a bar mitzvah, supposed to have a bar mitzvah on Shabbos HaGadol, so they had a virtual bar mitzvah on Tuesday night before, and everybody was on Zoom, and then when it came for him to Lane, my daughter muted everybody in the Zoom. Afterwards, Rabbi Glasser from the Young Israel Passaic spoke, and he said it's the quietest the shul has ever been during Kriyas HaTorah, and he wants to know if he can get that Zoom option even during the year for his shul. So we're going to use that Zoom option, and we're as I said, unless you have a question. If you'd like, there is a chat. If you look at the bottom of your screen, if you pull up the options, there's a chat option. You can send in a question. You can make it private to me, so if you don't want everybody to know that you're asking the question, or if you want it generally, you can make it general, you can do it at any point. If I see that there are chat questions on the chat forum, I'll stop for a minute and check them out and ask questions. That might be even a little bit more orderly way of posing questions. Either way. So let me talk to you a little bit about what's going on, what we're learning, and we're learning as we go along. This is unprecedented, even in my career, and I've been in the field for over 40 years, and I've been doing trauma work for about 25 of them, and still this type of situation is really unprecedented, I think, for most of us in our lifetimes. I mean, people reference the closest approximation was the Spanish flu that was about 100 years ago. So it shows you how rare this is. But it's interesting how there's been sort of a progression in terms of issues and challenges that have come up with this. When we first started facing this, a lot of the webinars that I and others had given focused very much on hygiene and precautionary measures and how we can promote proper hygiene in ourselves and in our children to prevent the spread of this virus. As time went on and we realized how quickly it's progressing, it went from the hygiene talk to quarantine and how to manage being even self-imposed quarantine or a sort of government-imposed quarantine, and to address the stress and the tension that's associated with being quarantined, which is abundant, even more than I realized after I did my research. As things progressed further, unfortunately, I have to say last week, the bulk of the interventions and webinars that I gave had more to do with grief. And in fact, Ohel is now running 2 grief groups, one for men who have lost parents during COVID and one for women. And the women one we had to split in 2 because there were so many people that registered. I'm not sure if we can take any more, but maybe we'll continue them or open up new groups. Each group is 4 weeks long. But again, that's been unfortunately the focus and how deprived we have been of opportunities to really give the kavod acharon to people whom we owe so much and how to pay a shiva visit, etc. What's happening now is, I think there's 2 things happening. First of all, we're all kind of settling into this new reality. We're acclimating to this new reality of being home, of not being part of the community, of not going to school, of largely being confined to our home or leaving the home with a lot of tension and precaution. And on the one hand, or actually as my wife and my mother, who were the Latin-speaking members of our community, would say, it says in Yiddish, a Ziegewand, that we're getting like used to it. It's becoming our reality. Now, this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's beneficial because we take the abnormal and make it normal, it becomes more manageable. So if things that would otherwise be troubling, if we can make it as if it's part of the norm, then it doesn't trouble us so much. I happen to live in the 5 towns. I don't hear the airplanes flying overhead, although friends of mine duck when they're visiting because they're so low. You get used to it. You adjust to it. And I think we're starting to adjust to it. There's much less flurry of activity. There's less jokes. There's less, although there still are plenty online in terms of entertainment, it doesn't have the same freneticism, the frantic kind of attempts to hold on to what we had in terms of community and jobs and motility is now less intense. So I think we're starting to see that we're kind of getting used to it. So on the one hand, it takes away the, if you will, the pain to some extent, because we make it normal. On the other hand, it's going to make it harder for us to readjust when we go back. And there's actually data that suggests that people who are quarantined have a hard time reacclimating to the outside. So we have to sort of keep it in mind, and we have to probably cling, if you will, to the fact that this is not normal, that we want to have a communal life, we want to have socializing, we want to have schools. So it's helpful. On the other hand, it is something that we have to be a little bit cautious about as well, or at least realize that once this lifts, or once we are able to resume our normal lives, that may not be so simple. We're not just going to go right back the way things are. We're going to probably take some readjustment. Schools and shuls have to know that there probably have to be some reacclimation, gradual, or even in terms of some sort of commemoration or processing of going from what may start becoming something we're used to something that is different. Just to show you how extreme something like this can be, and I know I'm using a very extreme example. I'm a mother, Shalom, who was deported to Auschwitz very early, among the first people deported to Auschwitz, often used to talk about when the Hungarians showed up. Because as you know, the Hungarians, Romania, Southern Europe was only mostly were deported in the late 40s, towards the end of the war. And she had already been there for a year or two when they came. And she was struck by how upset they were and how they were like shrieking and crying and also displaced. And, you know, to her, this had become the norm. So you see, we can even adjust to something as horrific as that. Now, the general rule of thumb when we're in a stressful situation, as this is that whatever had been is more. That's, I mean, if I want to give it a general category, what was is even going to be more now. And that goes for what's positive as well as what's negative. So our strengths, whatever they are, our strengths as individuals, our strengths as a family, and our strengths as a community are now going to be mobilized, and we should mobilize them, and we should employ them to the utmost. So that resilience, that connection that we have to community, our emunah, our bitachon, our belief that there's a greater good, and that there's something even good behind all this. Our capacity to tolerate stress, to have various types of outlets or ways of coping. All these are going to be used all the more. So we're going to mobilize them, we're going to harness them, and we should. A lot of what we need during the time like this is self-awareness, to know yourself, to know your strengths and to know your vulnerabilities, because each one is going to be amplified while this is going on. So our strengths is even in terms of relationships, those relationships that are truly supportive and that are truly helpful and that give us a lift and give us strength are the relationships we're going to seek out. And I said communally as well. In terms of schooling, in terms of connection to the shul when we're not in shul, and connection to community at large. These are all aspects that we're going to use all the more. And we're all unique. It's important to know that what's an effective coping mechanism for Reuven may not be for Shimon. And especially in crisis situations, our individuality comes out all the more. So we have to be very careful not to sort of say, well, this works for me, it should work for everybody else, even within the family. It could be somebody very close to you, and yet for you, maybe losing yourself in a book, going, plunging into learning or intellectual activities may be a way of coping. And for your spouse, it might be more walks and exercise and yoga. And each one is right for themselves, because the more extreme the situation, the more of an individual we become. A metaphor I sometimes use is imagine a carpenter who's going to build a tool shed. So he can experiment. He can experiment with new material. He can experiment with different ways of building. Worst thing happens, his tools get wet. But if he's building an extension to his house, or if he's building a bedroom, a child's bedroom, he's going to use that which worked for him in the past, both methods and materials. And we're no different as human beings. When we're facing a nominal problem, we can experiment with different ways of coping. When we're facing an extreme problem, we're going to rely on what works for us. And by the way, as I said, these go for relationships, and we have to seek out those relationships, all the more so. Hopefully it's relationships that are within our homes, but sometimes they're not. And then it means reaching out to other people, whether it's your rabbi, whether it's a friend, whether it's a mentor, and not to be embarrassed that you need those connections. But it's also, as I said, it's also skills and resilience. But on the other hand, we also have to realize that we all have as well maladaptive ways of functioning. We all escape or look for the so-called quick fix and those things that work very simply for us. And again, if those were coping mechanisms that we had in the past and they were destructive coping mechanisms, then they're going to be, and even if we've gained mastery over them, and they're no longer haunting us like they had, they're going to come out all the more as we are, facing this stress of the quarantine and the danger of the coronavirus. So whether it's alcohol consumption, whether it's overeating, whether it's scapegoating, temper outbursts, whatever, again, we need that self-awareness, and we need to be aware of those things that we cling to when we're stressed. And by the way, to turn to others if they do rear their ugly head. Human change and growth, for the most part, occurs in an interpersonal context. That's why even psychotherapy is an interpersonal type of treatment. And ideally, again, it could be a spouse, a family member, a friend, but we may have to let them know, not be afraid of our vulnerability. We have to not be afraid of our humanity. We all have those tendencies. We all have a Yetzer Hara, and we all are born with vulnerabilities. And it may be necessary to turn to your wife, to your husband, and say, you know what happened? I'm starting to eat a lot of junk now. I'm starting to, crawl into bed a lot. I'm starting to find myself getting irritable and irascible. And therefore, turn to the person and let that person help us. There's no shame in that. If anything, that's a sign of strength. Another thing, and by the way, that goes for personal vulnerabilities as well. If you have a history of anxiety, even if, let's say, it's manageable, the anxiety is going to be greater. If you have a history of depression, and again, even if you have mastery over it, etc., it's going to be all the more pervasive now. Even a kid, imagine a child who has one of those, what we call dysregulatory disorders. They have ADHD, there's a restlessness. To be confined to a house, they're probably welcome the opportunity not to have to sit in a classroom, but still that kind of confinement may be very difficult for them. So again, we have to be aware of ourselves and our children and realize that all these tendencies are going to come out all the more as we're in this stressful situation. And the other thing that's important is right now, we're not solving problems. Let me just jump back for a second. Also, by the way, that goes for relationships too. Relationships, and I'm not talking about severely problematic relationships like abusive marriages or something like that, but areas of acrimony, those little pockets where we might have difficulties getting along with our spouses, our children, for that matter, bosses, if we're going to work, even if we're going to work online, neighbors, all those types of situations that are probably fixable, that even may be largely outweighed by the positive, but they're going to come out all the more. And so those little areas of difficulty, and we're seeing this from calls that we're getting at Ohel through our, we have a sort of basically a virtual office, which I'll talk about in a minute. These are the kind of situations that we're seeing. Now, we're not fixing things now. We're in a crisis. So right now, we're just trying to get by. We're just trying in a way to sort of survive, to get through this. And therefore, this is not a time necessarily that we're going to try to fix more long-standing problems. We're going to really try to just focus on, in fact, to some extent, putting on some Band-Aids, temporarily managing these problems. And once the situation once we're back, things get back to normal, so we hope they will soon, then we can address them. And that's the message we're often giving to many people who call. Right now, yes, you have a tendency towards anxiety. Your anxiety is reaching a more severe state now because of what's going on around us. That's understandable, but right now we're not treating your anxiety. If it means taking medication, even though you wouldn't have needed medication otherwise, now take medication, because we've got to get through this. And it's harder to work on this by Zoom. It's harder to work on this when you're homeschooling, trying to maintain your job, worrying about finances. So we're going to do a lot of Band-Aids. We're going to put fingers in the dike right now. And we'll solve but remember that these are solvable problems, or we're going to bypass certain difficult issues. Some of the calls that I've had to deal with were working with, so in nursing homes and hospital settings, we're working with staff, and some of the old political issues, some of the tensions between workers become all the greater in the stress and tension, and we're not solving them now. We're patching them up, and we're going to get through this crisis, and at that point, then we're going to solve those problems. And as I said, even if you're talking about some of the more, call them addictive or maladaptive responses to stress, again, we're not going to do recovery now. We're going to do what's necessary to prevent it from happening. We're going to, lock up the liquor. We're going to have someone else oversee our eating, and we'll be a little indulgent as well. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So you put on a few pounds, we'll take it off when it's over. I don't know about drinking, because that can really spiral out of control, but some of those behaviors that would, if you're very committed to your learning, etc., your learning's not up to snuff, okay, it's hard times, and we have to be a little indulgent with ourselves. I want to talk for a few minutes now about devices, tablets, going online and using that, obviously, to remain connected, which is what we're doing, but more importantly, using that to feel connected to the outside world, but also as a way to eat up the hours. I mean, and to use up the time. I'm sure we are all well aware, as well intended as the schools are, that this schooling online is not taking up as much as a day. Children are confined to their home, and if a parent needs to attend to their own work and needs to attend to their own home responsibilities, there's nothing better than planting the kid in front of a device, and they're mesmerized and contained for whatever amount of time that they're on them. Now, within the Orthodox community, we really run the gamut in terms of how much we indulge our children in these kind of devices. We have from one extreme to another. We have those that just sort of hand the kid over, and let the kid stay on as long as they want and whatever they want. And at the other extreme, we have families that have no internet, probably still have rotary phones, and are shunning this altogether. And I'm saying this without an iota of judgment. You know, we can have a lot of difference with our community. But the fact of the matter is, most of us, and I'm aware of this even in some communities, we'd be surprised that they do, to varying degrees allow and disallow our children, and for that matter, it should be the same for ourselves, to indulge in some of the entertainment, games, and just sheer time spent on these devices, and legitimately so. For most, I think it's fair to say that the majority of our population feel that there are some benefits to it. There's some distinct benefits. It's a reality that we have to face today, and we want to use it judiciously. However, again, and now we're in a crisis situation. We're in a storm. And if you're in a ship and you're in a storm, you just want to get through the storm. And then you'll worry about the other things that are less important after it's over. So right now, we may indulge ourselves and our children a little bit more in these devices. You may have only allowed it, I'm just saying as an example, I've only allowed it for an hour or two on the weekend, and now you're going to allow it for a few hours during the day. It may be necessary. Again, we're just trying to get through the day. I was on one call. I was running a group for parents with children who have actually challenges. And one parent was saying that she's fighting with her kid over how much he's using the devices. And I really advocated that right now, getting along when you're confined to the house like this is more important. And I even assured her that once this is over, I will help her kid get off the devices if my wife can ever get me off my devices. But we have to, right now, besides the fact that it's allowing us to have workshops like this, to have school, they're also important babysitters, and they're more important forms of eating up many hours a day where there isn't all that much to do. And if you need it and you have to indulge a little bit more, like with everything else, by all means use it. By the way, an interesting aside, and this is sort of like a paradox, if you will. There are some children, for that matter, adults, for whom this crisis is actually beneficial. I've become aware of kids for whom school is a struggle, whether it's because of the self-restraint, whether it's because of learning disabilities, whether because of social difficulties, where school is a struggle. It's an irony of our existence, and it's way beyond the scope of what we're talking about now. But while we are aware that we have a myriad of different types of children with different tendencies, we have one type of school. And I say we, I mean the whole world, whether it's in the Hasidic community, in the Yeshivish community, in the modern community, or for that matter, in Bangladesh. We have schools are these buildings with desks where kids have to sit in the desk and listen to teachers talk about stuff that for the most part is not terribly relevant or doesn't look very relevant to their lives. Some kids are fit in beautifully. Some kids manage it very well. Other kids, it's a struggle, and we try to adjust and adapt, treat, and make it workable for them. But there are kids, I said, for the host of reasons that I mentioned, where this is a very welcome break, and they're actually doing quite well. For other kids, it's a struggle. There are adults as well, for whom those who are struggling financially. Now we're all sort of in the same boat. It wouldn't even surprise me if, when all this is over, we're going to have much more working from home, working remotely, or for that matter, kids who are going to be homeschooled. But I think as parents see that certain children just don't sort of fit the mold, or we'll have more of an expectation that we adjust this kind of monolithic model of providing education and adjust accordingly. It might be one of the lessons we'll learn from this crisis period. Now, by the way, in terms of remote schooling, that's another point that I want to make, and I hope I won't get myself in trouble with Mrs. Ackman, although I have a lengthy history of getting in trouble with principals. But I don't think it's all that important right now how much a child learns or what skills the child is mastering. I think we should look at the remote schooling as right now maintaining the momentum, maintaining the connection to the teacher, to the school, and teaching our children that education is not something that is halted. But whether they actually learn the extra perek of Chumash or whether they actually master the particular mathematical skill, again, I think right now it's very important as we're confined to our homes that the homes remain as harmonious as possible. And I would say that if it's going to create stress, if it's going to create friction, I think it's better to look the other way. And again, look at the remote learning as sort of like just keeping us connected, keeping our children connected to the school, to the whole educational process until such time that we can bring them back and let them continue their education as it had existed before. So again, for the sake of Shalom Bayis, for the sake of harmonious existence and minimizing more stress upon stress. And by the way, some of you may be familiar with the mathematics of stress, or as one of my colleagues likes to say, 5 out of 4 psychologists don't know math. So let me tell you what the math of stress is. If there are 2 stresses and each, let's say, has a value of 2, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. 2 plus 2 equals 8. Stress upon stress grows exponentially. And therefore, again, we have to try to, whatever stress we have control, we don't have control over the stress of the coronavirus, but we do have, what we have to control over, we have to consider. Now, another very painful and difficult result of this crisis is the various types of milestones or the events or developments that were supposed to take place that we had looked forward to that hadn't taken place. One thing, again, I skipped when I talked about the various stages that we went through with this coronavirus was pre-Pesach and the disappointment that we're not going to be together as families, those who had maybe trips planned or other types, even Cholamoid trips planned, not having them. And for that matter, of course, people who are alone, mostly the elderly, although not necessarily the case. I was made aware of one person who is a Baal Tshuva, who lives in an apartment in the city and had no place to go Pesach because he couldn't go back to family. Nobody outside the family wanted him, so had a Pesach alone in a small apartment in the city. So there are others as well affected. But now there are other anticipated milestones, etc. There are bar mitzvahs, weddings that are either truncated or postponed. I mentioned my grandson had an online bar mitzvah after a year preparing and anticipation. There's graduation and all that comes with graduation, whether it's the trip, the yearbook, all just the excitement of being 8th graders, 12th graders, seniors in college. That are important. They're not just frivolous activity. They're very monumental events that commemorate and capture many years of hard work, etc. There are people that were expecting a bonus at work, were expecting a promotion. There were people who were in between jobs, not in between jobs necessarily because they lost their job, but they left a job feeling quite secure that there would be other possibilities awaiting them, and then suddenly, the rug has been pulled out from under them. So there might have been an anticipated promotion. So these are all very difficult, and we should not ever, ever, ever minimize or play down how important they are. In fact, some of us who are adults might say, all right, listen, bar mitzvahs are nice, but it didn't make a difference for us in the bigger picture. It does make a difference. It's a red letter date. It's a very important part of the child. It's something they've looked forward to. Certainly a wedding is as well. And I think we have to be sympathetic. And by the way, it's a very big chunk of what we're doing nowadays. I know I'm doing it as someone who's fielding a lot of calls of people who are experiencing crisis during this time. I'm validating. I'm sympathetic. And rather than solving. And I think this is also something that we have to validate and acknowledge that, we feel terrible. We didn't want this to happen. It's not like we spoiled it for you, but this makes it all the more difficult, and especially for children, because those events, I mean, I'm sure many of us online here can certainly fondly remember our Washington trip after 8th grade, or the celebrations that surrounded our graduation, or other types of events like this. And it's an important part of childhood, and we should not minimize it even for children, even though from our perspective, they may not seem so important. And another thing that I think we have to start thinking about, it's premature now, so I don't know if we can yet in a definitive way address it, but I think maybe with sort of an ounce of prevention, or with a little bit of foresight, is what the summer is going to look like. Because it's far from certain that there will be sleepaway camp, whether there will be day camp, we don't know. I'm aware that people are starting to purchase above ground pools and other things in anticipation that children may be home for the summer. But again, camp is not just a luxury. Maybe it was 100 years ago, or 150 years ago. Or maybe it is in other countries that aren't as affluent as ours. But for our children, their landscape, their time landscape includes that time in camp. And that time in camp is very precious time for growth, a time for like socialization, for independence. And again, I'm sure many of us look back to our years in camp. And not everybody's a camper, and some kids may not have gone to camp, and that's perfectly okay. But for many of us, camp was a very integral part of shaping us and of our childhood, which may not, we don't know, but may occur in more truncated form. I know there's a lot of conversation about this among the camps and the umbrella organizations of Jewish camps, and I think we just have to keep that in mind to sort of brace ourselves that becomes, and again, it is bad. I mean, it's not a calamity, but it's a deprivation. And it's one of the many deprivations that we shouldn't at all minimize. We also have to be careful about one more thing, which again, I should have probably said that in that timeline, but I think we might be, I'm starting to see as well, is those people for whom the confinement is difficult are getting very impatient. And as there are hints in the media and from government officials that this is now starting to turn a corner, that we may have peaked already, and even though there's still a lot of devastation and terrible, and as we know personally, death and et cetera, and there's still risk of contracting this dreaded illness, there's already a little bit more talk about starting to open up things, certain regions in the country that already are opening up businesses. And there's a certain impatience, and some people may be sort of foaming at the bit to too quickly venture out there and start trying to resume aspects of their life, or stop taking as many precautions as is still warranted. So again, we have to, especially again, for some people who tend to be more spontaneous, tend to be more social, tend to need outside stimulation much more. I'll share with you something actually very interesting. During the first week of confinement, I noticed myself that I was having very vivid dreams. And I actually said to my wife that I think because I have much less visual stimulation, that my brain is dreaming more vividly to make up for it. And sure enough, last week there was an article I saw in which they said precisely that people are reporting very vivid dreams, and it's to compensate for the lack of stimulation. So those who really need that outside stimulation, really need to get out more, they may be rushing it a bit. And we have to be careful. We have to do it in accordance with what health experts are saying. And again, the health experts, there might be some variants. We'll talk about that in a minute, some inconsistent messages, but as best as, as much as a consensus as exists, we have to adhere to that and gingerly return as it's sanctioned to our more normal life. I mentioned one or two more things that I think are important. I do want to leave some time for questions, so I'll be a little bit quick. Very important during this time is gratitude. I've mentioned this a lot, so those who've heard me before, you've heard this already. There's a remarkable literature in psychology, actually research, measuring and demonstrating how much healthier and how much better people are off when they not only feel gratitude, but enumerate gratitude, keep a gratitude diary. People who are able to express gratitude for what's positive in their life have less anxiety, less depression. They're healthier, they sleep better, they are more productive at work. There's even some research to show that more dopamine and serotonin and dopamine are secreted in the central nervous system. So that's actually a natural antidepressant and and tranquilizer. And that's good in the best of times. But when we're so deprived as we are now, it's all the more important that we have to identify that which we have to be grateful for, and then really literally specify grateful for our family members, grateful for our friends, grateful for our community that we're deprived of, grateful for the technology that allows us to connect like this. And we have to enumerate that. I'm going to mention very quickly, though I've spoken about it a little bit more in previous times, the humor is great. There's a lot of good jokes out there, but humor that's not at somebody else's expense. In other words, not minimizing or trivializing any kind of hardship that people are going through, but humor that captures the irony, the preposterousness of the situation we're in, relieves some of the pain, and also expresses how ludicrous all this is. As I mentioned before, be clear and be aware of your strengths, of your fortitude, and of your emunah, of your bitachon, because all this will come to help you. And apropos to that, I want to mention one more thing that I think is a huge element of stress for all of us in these situations, and how we can deal with it, and then I'll open up for questions, and that's the ambiguity. There's, again, a body of literature in psychology that shows that ambiguity breeds anxiety. We like certainty. Chazal said it very brilliantly, in Simcha Kataras Asfekas. I know my friend and colleague David Pelkowitz often mentions that, one of the words in Hebrew for happiness is ashrei, ashrei yisecha, and it's the same word as ishur, which is validation. If there's certainty, we feel, even sometimes negative certainty. Some of you maybe haven't had this experience. I've certainly observed it, of people who are waiting for test results after, let's say, a surgical procedure. And those test results might be life and death, might give information that could be either a sign that the surgery was successful or that they're facing a dismal future. And when they get the results, and even if the results were, it's hard to say positive or negative, but were bad news, many people say that was easier to handle than that waiting period, that not knowing. And there's a lot of ambiguity about this illness and what kind of trajectory it's going to take. Will there be a herd immunity? Will it recur next winter? Will there be cures? Will there be a vaccination? So there's a lot more that's unknown. Now that has one implication of that is we have to be careful about what sources of information, what are our sources of information, especially today's age of technology, where we're literally bombarded with news, and there's so many different sources of news and information, and we have to learn how to take all of that with the proverbial grain of salt, and also be selective. Even just the sheer volume of information can be incredibly stressful. But also we have to accept the fact that there's a lot we don't understand. There's a lot more we don't know about this than we do know. Even the great scientists and government officials don't know that. We're not used to that in today's world. We live in an age of remarkable technology, huge medical gains, research and procedures, and we really live with the myth that we can tackle anything. And maybe that's the reason for it, I don't know, but Hashem came along and introduced this imperceptible virus that literally pulled the plug on the whole world. So it's something we're not really used to. Now, I'm going to propose to you two ways to cope with that, and then we'll open up for questions. One is a simpler way, which is if we look historically, and that's all we can do. We can't predict the future. I always like to quote the great theologian and philosopher Yogi Berra, who used to say that prognosticating is very difficult, especially about the future. We can't predict the future, but we know historically in the past that whether it was plagues, crises, periods of difficult economic hardship, which is also part of this right now, we don't know how that's going to play out either. They've all had a beginning, middle, and end. Nothing has lasted forever. And I think it might be important for us to know that even though right now we don't know how this is going to unfold, that this is a crisis, this is if you call it a gezerah, decree, whatever, it will resolve. Historically, history would dictate that it will reach some resolution, will emerge from it. Question is what the fallout will be and what damage will be done, and there's plenty of damage already, but this will have a beginning, middle, and end. And another, a little more complex way, and I think that's an appropriate way to end, especially for a yeshiva parent body, is to surrender to the ambiguity, to surrender to the fact that we just don't know. It's a humbling experience, but it fits very neatly with our way of looking at life, that there is Hashem, there is a greater power, there is some good and even something that looks terrible to us. We are in a journey, if you will. Our lives are not just random lives, that we're in a historical progression leading to the long-awaited day of Mashiach. And we don't understand everything, and we don't know everything. And with all our technology and with all our advances, that we're hapless pawns in the evolution of history. And there's something very soothing about that. There's something that is tranquilizing, sedating about that, because as I said, it's a surrender, and it's a recognition of that which we've been taught and that we've practiced all our lives. So that's an alternative way of dealing with the stress of the ambiguity. Again, I hope what I've said has been helpful. I want to just mention that those who may need further assistance or have further questions, you can contact the Ohel Trauma Team. We have a designated email address. It's called copingwithcovid19 at ohelfamily.org. That's copingwithcovid19 at ohelfamily.org. If you want to try to reach me, my Ohel email address is Norman_Blumenthal at ohelfamily.org. It might take me a while to get back. I'm fairly bombarded, but I answer all requests and questions. We also have a virtual office, as I mentioned, open from 10 to 12 during the day, and 10 to 12 during the day, 8 to 10 at night. It's on the Ohel website. It's a TheraZoom, it's called, but you can go online. You'll be greeted by a receptionist, put in a totally confidential waiting room until someone, a crisis therapist, is available to meet with you. There's no charge, and of course, all HIPAA laws apply in this. There is total confidentiality. So those are, and there are many other ways to get assistance. I'm just mentioning the ones that I'm familiar with. And again, let me, at this point, open up to, I don't see any chat, so maybe somebody wants, the chat just came on. All right, so let me just quickly see. This is a private one, so we don't know who it's from. Okay, so a very good question. So basically, I'm going to paraphrase the question, is that there's a lot of inconsistent information. Besides abundant information, some information calling for precautions, for extreme precautions, others that play down or minimize those kind of precautions. How do we get some certainty in this? And I will tell you to do the following. It may not be the answer you want to hear, but I don't think we know. I think there is a lot of unknown. Now, granted, if you find out that you should not eat garlic because the coronavirus is in garlic, and even garlic powder that was made 2 years ago has coronavirus, or something like ludicrous like that. Look at the source of the information. That's part of, in fact, that might be one of the silver linings of this crisis. We're going to have to learn how to, it's a different world in terms of getting news and information in today's social media world, and where we're bombarded with so much information. So we're going to have to learn how to filter and know what information is useful, is from a reliable source, and what is not. I mean, unfortunately, we know that from stuff that's printed about Israel. So that's one thing. Try to get a consensus, and you might have to designate. It's almost like Asay L'Charav. You might have to say, look, I'm going to follow the CDC. I'm going to follow the Board of Health. I'm going to follow the information that's provided by this medical group. I'm going to follow the information that I read from this scientific journal, and follow that consistently, because again, there's so much we don't know. I don't think we can reliably say that this one's telling the truth, this one's not. Now again, if it's one article from a fairly marginal source, you might have to be a little bit more dismissive about it. But if there's a few pieces of information that are suggesting precautions that some of the mainstream media are not, maybe check it out with someone a little bit more knowledgeable, or just make a decision yourself. I'm going to follow this, I'm going to follow that. But absolute certainty, I don't think we're anywhere near that, because of the so little, that even the experts know about this scourge that we're going through. Let me just see if there's any other chats. No. Anybody want to unmute themselves? Oh, here comes another one. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. Anybody want to unmute themselves with a question, or? Let's wait a minute or two. If somebody Okay, which meant that I either did a great job or a terrible job because no questions. So either everybody's like tuned out or enough questions have been asked, or just people don't want to be in the limelight. Yeah, sorry, yes?
I want to thank you. It was very well done. I appreciated it. Everything was really on target.
Thank you, Ms. Berkovits. Okay. Okay, again, you have to unmute yourself and remute yourself if you want to ask anything. Okay. Mrs. Emmer, do you want to, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I have a question, actually. I couldn't unmute myself. Just in general, your approach seems to be sort of take the time to validate and how you're feeling right now. My question is, hashkafically, sometimes we're hearing how now's the time that you really have to work on your middos and identify areas that judge people favorably, and maybe even as a member of the board and as a member of the greater community. Now, I was wondering your thoughts about that, because sometimes people's behavior isn't in line with how you feel they should act, either, as a community member, as a board member, and how much emphasis should we be putting on ourselves regarding working on our middos versus just keeping the status quo when hashkafically we're supposed to take something out. So that, if you can comment on that.
No, I think that's, again, obviously, from a theological perspective, I'll leave that to the bigger beards and more legitimately so. But yes, I didn't get a chance to get to everything, but one of the ways of coping with a crisis is what's called in psychology meaning making or post-traumatic growth, which is that we try to cull lessons from it. In fact, the research after 9/11 shows the survivors from 9/11, I think right after, was 2/3 talked about different ways in which they enhanced their lives. So it's not just us, it's universally a way of, and what that does is it chips away from the seeming senselessness of what we're going through. Now, of course, obviously, theologically, and then the better people can talk about that, it's also, that's what we do. We look inside of ourselves. We try to see how we can improve ourselves when we're going through hardship. And that's a very traditional Jewish way of doing things. So yes, I think that can be really part of our plan. And I don't think that's a contradiction. And I don't believe just indulging everything. I mentioned earlier, there's some bad habits, maladaptive ways of coping that we have to keep in check. I'm just not, and I think we can think about the lessons. And my hunch is, two thoughts I have is, my hunch is that that's a slower process. And what I've seen is usually you have to be out of it to most effectively learn from it. So I think we need to launch that process and start thinking about it. Have we conducted ourselves in shul the way we should, now that we miss shul so much? There's a lot of talk about maybe some of the extravagances in terms of simchas, and maybe we have to be more humble. I mean, again, these are things I'm hearing. And time together, that appreciate the time with family, that now that we're spending so much time together, so that there might be a lot that we can learn from it. But as I said, sometimes when you're in it, it's a little hard. I remember someone once mentioned to me that if you look at the Megillah, they didn't declare the Yom Tov of Purim until a year after the Nes of Purim, that you need some time to collect. So sometimes when you're in it, it's a good time to start thinking, but I think the lessons maybe have to be accrued once we're out of it and we look back on it. I'm reminded, actually, I'll have to say, lahavdil, of a story about Abba Ibn, when they first built the first luxury hotel in Yerushalayim. I don't know which one it was, whether it was the Sheraton or the Crown Royal or whatever, but the first, multi-level, high building hotel. He was riling against it. He was very against it. He was writing articles. He felt it spoiled the atmosphere, the scenery, the landscape of Yerushalayim and all that. Anyway, after the hotel was built, the reporter once went to the restaurant on the top floor and sits there with Abba Ibn. He's sitting in the hotel eating. So I came to him and said, Mr. Ibn, I thought you hate this place. He said, I do. So what are you doing here? He said, are you kidding? This is the only place where I can't see the darn thing. So when you're in it, you sometimes can't see it. So I think that's very important. I really hope, in fact, it would really be like Baltashkas, if when we come out of this, if we go right back to all our old bad habits and we haven't grown from it. And I think that's a very important part of what we have to take from this. I think we can launch that process now, but I don't think we're going to complete it because we're still in the midst of it. I see some chats sort of emerged, so let me just quickly look. How to not be worried all the time. Great question. Okay, so let me explain to you how that works. Okay, and it's a similar question. How do we know what's regular anxiety in the crisis? Very good. Two very good questions. Okay, so how to not worry all the time? Worry is good because worrying prompts action. So if we're worried about our health, then we'll, exercise and lose weight and do good things. But worrying so there can be too little worry and there can be too much worry. The same thing, by the way, with anxiety. It can be too little anxiety, there can be too much anxiety. If you have too little anxiety, you're not going to take precautions. If you have too much anxiety, you're going to be crippled. So you have to worry, but worrying has to be portioned out. And worrying has to be constructive. There are actually, one of the techniques used, it's a little too gimmicky for me. I don't like gimmicks, but some people use it, therapists use it for people who have sort of a pervasive anxiety, is that they schedule time to worry. So that they have from some 7 to 8 at night, they're going to sit and worry. Now, I don't know if that works, but you have to worry. And then when the worry gets circular, you have to stop and take a break from it. You have to, it's interesting also that, we often talk, we have a lot of defense mechanisms, psychological defense mechanisms. And one of them is denial, where you deny reality. And everybody puts down denial. It's, you're denying reality. It's like an insult. Or the joke, everybody's favorite river is denial. But you know something? We have a capacity to deny reality for a very good reason, because sometimes reality is pretty hard. And the fact that we've had such good lives is the reason why we put down this denial. But sometimes you have to just say, there's no coronavirus right now. I'm not dealing with it right now. I'm going to worry about it later. So actually deny the reality and put it away from you. The same thing, by the way, with anxiety. You have to have a moderate amount. We need anxiety right now. You have to be anxious because we have to take precautions. But we can have too little or too much. You have to sort of titrate it, as the doctors say. Okay, what are the messages should we give young children during this time? That's a very general question, and I'm not sure if I can, give it sort of a general answer. But I think we can explain to children a lot of things we can learn from this. We can learn, again, that we're not in control. It's a very good religious message that things happen that are not under our control. We can, some children may have to learn that this is a very tricky thing, and I want to say this delicately, but early on and even now, there was some cynicism from certain subsets in our community about what the government was reporting and what the media is reporting. And some of that's legitimate because sometimes, if we believe everything the media says, there are a lot of things we'd have to believe that we know are not true, but not to take a sort of blanket cynicism that there really was accurate that there was a crisis now, and to learn to respect those kind of warnings. To learn to adjust, learn about the strength and the resilience of a person. That human beings human beings what we can do and what we can accomplish. And something, I think we're going to look back. Everybody, please mute your phones, yeah. We're going to look back and see how much we did and how much strength we actually had. What if you don't feel good from being worried? Well, you're not supposed to feel good. That's the point. Worry, look, if life is great and you're sitting and worrying, then you have, then you probably have some sort of depression or anxiety, which again, it's not the end of the world and we can treat it. But when the situation warrants it, it's painful, but it's productive. I don't like pain, but thank God we have pain, because the capacity to experience pain teaches us to be careful and to be careful about fire, to be careful about slippery surfaces, etc. So worry is not nice, and we're not in a time that will breed a whole lot of happiness right now. So it's not supposed to feel good, but it has to be proportionate to the crisis that exists, the worry. And if it's circular, if it's worrying for the sake of worrying, then it's problematic. If it's worrying to lead to a solution, then that can be helpful and productive. Okay, we've got about a minute left, so anybody want to get in the last word or the last question, or? All right. Mrs.
Thank you.
Zemmer, do you want to? Okay,
Yeah,
gotta
thank
close
you,
out, yeah.
Blumenthal. I think you gave us a lot of practical advice, practical suggestions, and a lot of validation of how we're all feeling. I really appreciate your time, and we should meet again under good time.
You got it. It's a deal.
Okay.
Okay.
You
Thank you. Be well, everybody.
Be well.
Okay. My
Bye.
pleasure. Thank you.